Secret Circle.
Welcome back to The Secret Circle with me, Dr. Luke Decker, the podcast where I chat with authors, filmmakers, musicians, and more about the art of their craft and let you in on some of their secrets. Today's guest is former detective inspector turned author Roger Price, and today we are going to let you in on some of his secrets. Roger, welcome to the show.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So one question I like to ask all writers when I bring them on is, I'm always curious as to why you feel the need or the compulsion to write and tell stories.
Well, good question. That a very fundamental one, I think, isn't it?
Mm.
I think I don't know. I think it must just be in your DNA. It's something I always wanted to do
Mm.
throughout my life. I have had various influences. I remember my father was quite a lot older than average fathers, and I was the last of a long brood, and
Mm.
um, and when I was growing up, he was always writing a book about his war years,
Oh.
which I just found the whole concept of that fascinating.
Mm.
That he's writing a book, and when he's
Yeah.
your father, and he's an older father, more sort of father age, really. I was so
Yeah.
impressed with that, and that probably had a indelible mark on me. And eventually, after 30 years, he managed to write something which wasn't published; it was just printed off among the
Mm.
family. But I was just sort of awestruck by that, and I've always had this desire to sort of to write, but never had the time when I was working detective, But
Yeah.
I sort of did some courses. I went to night school and try to learn, how the structure, some of the craft involved, rather than just go into it blind. But
Mm.
never really had the time to do it. And then they sort of kick you out when you're fairly young, the police.
Mm.
They sort of booted me out when I was at 50. So I started my own company for a while, did some private stuff, which is terribly boring. Did some consultancy work, which is also very boring, but that was lucrative but boring.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then I thought,
When you say private stuff, what do you mean by private? Were you like a private eye? Like, would you?
yeah, well, yeah, I suppose I was, yeah, but it
Okay.
all ends up being corporate stuff. I didn't want to do anything salacious or
Right.
domestic, I didn't want to get involved in all that. Stood at the top of the
Like
ladder.
Philip Marlowe, no divorces.
Exactly. I don't want to stood at the top of ladders with binoculars, you don't be doing all that. You get locked up for being a perv, So I did fancy that, and I
Yeah.
did some corporate stuff, and I helped set up Durham Constabulary's undercover unit. Did all that for them, and that was quite good
Mm.
fun. But then I thought, I've always wanted to have a go at writing. This is about 12 years ago now,
Mm.
and I thought, okay, I have no more excuses. Give it
Yeah.
a go and see what
Yeah.
happens. And here I am, sort of 10, 11, 12 years later.
Yeah, with a good number of books under your belt. Um, so what was the journey like to getting published then? Because I know everyone has a different journey with that. Some have found it very easy getting in. Some have found it very difficult. Was it hard getting
No,
represented? Was it, was it easy? How did that work out for you?
I think it's a continual roller coaster, really. I mean,
Yeah.
initially, oh God, is it? Initially, I tried to learn my craft. I went to night school. I got an accreditation for advanced creative writing, and I went on
Nice.
courses and read as much as I possibly could within the genre that I wanted to write, and then I had a go. And when I first finished my first draft,
Mm.
I paid for a literary consultant to rip it to shreds,
Wonderful.
which was expensive, and it was in shreds.
Yes.
So it came back with all the red pen on it and whatever. You sort of marched around the room, headbutted the wall a few times, and eventually you calm down and start taking
Yeah.
on board this sage-like advice. And
Yeah.
and that became a template for the first 2 or 3 books. I really went back to that over and over and over again. The
Mm.
learning was massive, really. We're talking about things like point of view and not head hopping and
Yeah.
deciding who your main viewpoint characters are and telling your story through your characters as much as you possibly can. All the
Yeah.
stuff you know about anyway, and not
Yeah.
using a thorough voice, which I still see loads of when I'm reading for pleasure myself. And it's one of my little rants when I'm reading stuff now. It's if you can't tell somebody, the readers, about the characters without sort of uploading like a manual of description, then I
Yeah.
just find that's just like lazy writing, if I'm being perfectly honest. So I did all that, and then I thought, right, I've done all this preparation. I've got this first draft of my first book now in some sort of shape. It'll be easy, won't it? Yeah. No, it
Yeah.
won't. So I think after about 18 months, 2 years of rejections, I think I got my first offer, and then I went to a publisher, and they were a hybrid publisher. They were publishing traditional contracts, and then they moved into wanted the authors to help out with the cost of it.
Right. Right.
So a little bit of vanity there
Yes.
involved.
Who do you mind me asking who that publisher was?
Yeah, that was Pegasus.
Pegasus. I didn't know they did that.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if they still. They might not now. They did then. Maybe they were just emerging themselves, and they were quite a good publisher in a lot of ways. Looking back, they weren't one of these pure vanity firms. To be
Yeah,
very
yeah.
fair to them, but you still wanted the author buy-in, which I wasn't prepared to do really, if I'm honest. So I had my first two books with them. So I thought, right, I'll start a new series. It's like you
Mm.
can't just sort of go to a new publisher with a series part way through. They're not really interested usually. So and then I
Yeah.
thought it'll be easier now, won't it? I'm a published author. I'm getting great reviews on these first two books. It'll be easier.
Yeah.
So fast forward about another, I can't remember now. It could have been 2 years of rejections,
Mm.
and I eventually got a new deal with Loom, as it was. They were
Mm.
Endeavour Press then, and I got 3 books with them and an anthology. And then things changed and went a bit cold there. So I thought, right, I'll move again. And
Yeah.
again, you've got to start with a new series, have you not?
Yeah.
Generally speaking. So I went with that. Took me about 8 months. Getting better now. About 8 months of rejections,
Mm.
and I signed with Dark Age Press, a new imprint. I thought I'd try this new firm. They sound
Yeah.
great, and that was Inside Threat, the first in the D.S. Draker series.
Mm.
And on the day Inside Threat was published last November, they announced they were going bust.
Yes, I
So
remember that. Oh man, that must
remember
have
that.
been terrible yeah.
So that was a bittersweet moment. Publication day. Oh, by the way, we're going bust. So
So let's pause and chat about that for a minute? 'Cause that
oh
that
yeah,
that was a crazy situation. Like it's such a sad thing when
isn't it? Yeah,
an indie goes under like that. And I quite
yeah,
like Dark Edge Press.
yeah.
They publish a couple of my friends. And yeah, I mean, so did you have any idea that that was coming? That you know the day of publication, was there any warning signs
No,
or any just on the day they're like, by the way, we're going under?
no, there wasn't. I mean, Louise, I love her to death. She was great. She was very, very hard working and very for
Yeah.
her authors. And I think she said to me at the time she didn't want to burst my bubble on pub day, so she sort of let that ride. And I got an email, and I think it was the day after,
Yeah.
which went out to everybody. So it was a sad, sad time for them. But of course, that was part of a 4-book deal I had with them. Um,
Right.
and
Right.
whilst the first book, Inside Threat, was going through all the pre-production stuff, which takes time, as you know,
Mm.
I'd been beavering away. I'd written the next 2 in the series, which was Double Cross
Yeah.
and Red Herring.
Yeah.
Uh, so when they went, I've got a real dichotomy here now. I've got a book that's going to be hard to place because it's already been published. It's
Right.
always going to
Yeah.
be tricky, that, isn't it? And I've got
Yes.
2 more books that I can't really sell until I place the first one.
Yeah.
So that was well tricky. So I had about 6 months of rejections on the back of that. And
Yeah.
then God bless Richard at Sharp Books,
Yeah.
pitched to him, and he likes backlists. And I can't give him a backlist, I haven't got the rights, but I can give
Mm.
you a bit of a front list if you're interested.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the pitch. That was actually the pitch, Luke. And he said, okay, you will take all 3, but I want to bring all 3 out at once.
Ah.
And that's what happened. So
Right. Right.
that's only October, just gone. So yeah,
Yes.
so that's
Yes.
all pretty
Yes.
new.
Man.
That's an
So
abridged journey of my publication history. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's a everyone's journey is crazy because no two journeys are the same. Um. Yeah. No. That's nuts. So did the with the company going under, like with rights and stuff like that, were they how did they give them back to you? Did they give them back to you? How did that work? Did you need to pay or anything? Like, I don't,
No,
because that's something that I don't know anything about.
they were good as gold. All the rights were reversed
Okay.
immediately. The
Right.
letters sent out via email to all the authors, so there was
Right.
no messing about.
That's good. That's good, man. That is such a shame. Um,
Mm.
how do you find the like the editorial process working with publishers? Has that been an easy process or a difficult process? Like before, when you were starting out, you were just kind of you know paying people to rip the book to shreds.
Yeah.
Do you find that a better process doing that beforehand, or do you still do that before you send it to publishers, or your publisher rather?
In the early years, I used to send my
Mm.
books out to beta readers to get the sort of story right, and
Mm.
then I would go to that original paid editorial advice and sort of juxtaposition it really with what
Yeah.
I've done to get it to what I call submission standards, so it's as good as I can get it. And it's like you get to a stage where you
Yeah.
can't see the wood for the trees yourself. You've gone as far as you can,
Yes.
uh,
Yeah.
and
What's
then
your
it
what's
goes
your
on to the publisher. Go on.
Yeah, what's your take on beta readers? I mean, I've had some experience with them, and it's a very mixed bag. I think when I was working on the book that was used for my PhD, I at one point was like, oh,
Congratulations, by the way, Doctor. Before I forget,
thank you very
I've not,
much. I appreciate it, much
haven't
appreciated.
got spoken to you in person since you got the good news, but yeah, carry on.
Yes, no, thank you. Yes, yes. But yeah, I asked some people to do some beta reading, I did it on Twitter, and a lot of people responded saying, "Oh yeah, I would love to read it. Would love to." Blah, blah, blah." I think out of the like 10 or 15 people who wanted to read it, um, I want to say like maybe one person actually read it and got back to me. Um,
Right.
one woman replied, and she was like in her Twitter bio. I should have known from the beginning. In her Twitter bios, things like Jesus loving individual, and it's not a knock on religion, but I was like, this book is a very dark post World War II book. It's not going to hold punches. There's some cursing in there. There's some real gritty stuff in there. And she was like, this book just has too much cussing for me. And I'm like, okay, that's you're probably not the target market for this book. For
Yeah.
this book anyway. But yeah, so basically I've never found beta reading helpful. So I'm wondering, if have you found beta readers insightful or helpful, or do you have a specific group that you go to?
I don't use them now. I think the way I used them at the beginning when I was still
Mm.
learning, and you don't stop learning, do you? But I was still learning the
Yeah.
sort of the basics, shall we put it
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. And I wanted to know whether the story was good enough. And
Mm-hmm.
I used to say to the beta readers, and I chose people I could trust,
Yeah.
not only to read it and to be honest, but to be honest as well, particularly. I used to say, forget
Yeah.
grammar, forget structure even. I
Yeah.
just want to know, does the story work?
Right. Yeah.
And once you know the story's good, then I can play around with the structure and make sure my lead, viewpoint characters have got enough chapters, and so the reader knows whose story is being told, who's telling the story, so it's
Mm.
not vague. If you have too much sort of narrative split between too many characters, it can get a bit disconcerting, I think, for the readers to who's actually telling the story. And so these are the sort of questions that I was asking the beaters, so I can get that right. Um,
Mm.
and sort of 2 or 3 books down the road, I didn't really feel I needed that
Sure.
advice. I
Sure.
thought I'm okay. I'm comfortable now in how I'm structuring my story. I'm comfortable in the story itself, and then so I've sort of
Yeah.
dropped that off really. And
Yeah.
whether that's the right decision or not, I'm not sure, Luke. But so I've sort of moved on a little bit from that. But I can
Yeah.
understand your disquiet about the beach readers, because it's a you know, and only
Yeah.
being honest, you
Yeah.
don't want
Yeah.
smoke, you don't want smoke being blown up your derriere, but then again,
No.
you don't want people being overcritical because they feel they've got a voice, and it gives them a soapbox to be critical for the sake of it either. It can be.
Yes. 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 Oh man, I can tell you many stories sitting through when I sat through my masters. During the master's program, there's one of the classes that you do is essentially a writers group where everyone bring not every week couple of students have brought in some work that everyone has read prior, and you critique it basically.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and when you're you're one in a group of 15 people or so, there's bound to be some some big heads in the room. And yeah, I just remember so many times just sitting there while people are like, a couple people critiquing like something I've submitted, or someone that I like submitted, and they're just going off on these just really crazy tangents because they have this sort of like air of superiority about how they think a story should work. Or
yes,
the one of the things that made me laugh was this one girl really went after this one guy who had written a female protagonist, and she's like, I don't see why you think you should be able to write a female protagonist. And he was he was a very nice kind of guy, and he didn't really want to push back, and he sort of was like, oh well, maybe I'll rethink it. Yeah, maybe I need to rethink it. But then the irony is, the next week that same girl came back with her work, and she was writing from a male perspective, and
wow,
that male perspective was being really like male gazy towards female characters and things like that. And I'm like, it's interesting that you were mad that this guy was writing from a female perspective and was not being oogly or whatever, but then you come in with a rather kind of spicy, I would say, piece. It was just it's such a bizarre thing, those types of
hypocrisy, isn't it?
situations.
As well, it's utter hypocrisy that.
Yeah, it's so fun. But what I always say though with people is I always recommend, like, if you can get yourself a really good writers group of 5 or 6 people who you trust,
Yes,
that to me is by far the most, it's priceless in my opinion. Like, you get so much good advice from those few people that you trust, that for me, I'm like, beta readers never again.
I think you're absolutely right, and the key phrase there for me, Luke, is people you can trust.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I've had similar situations early on in my journey. I went on a website. I won't mention it because it still goes now. It's a great website, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but I don't want to give it a bad press.
Yeah.
Where you submitted sort of your first 3,000 words or whatever, and
Mm,
people would critique it, and you'd constructively, and then you would do the same for them.
yeah.
And my first book, my first two were full of quite a bit of angst in there. My first two, they were a little bit, well, they were quite good. They were very gritty actually, but I've sort
Yeah.
of calmed down a little bit from those earlier ones. But the opening scenes in By Their Rules, the first one,
Mm,
it was the courtroom being shown a videotape of a man being tortured, and it
right.
was fairly graphic. And there's a little bit of um, Connery about it insofar as the way it was presented was you feel like you were there watching this
Yeah.
scene, and then of course
Sure.
the reveal is actually a videotape being shown to the
Sure.
court, and that
Yeah.
was sort of the hook in.
Yeah.
And there was one guy who absolutely slaughtered it, and he claimed to be a court reporter for the Manchester Evening News, and he was
Okay.
saying this would never be shown in a court of law. It's too graphic.
Mm,
The language wouldn't be allowed. I thought, oh wait, hang on a minute. You know, I know all about evidence and presenting evidence in court. Um,
yes.
and I've known many, and still do court reporters. I've never heard such rubbish.
Yeah.
You can't doctor evidence because it's unpalatable to the jury.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the jury have a terrible job sometimes in
Yeah.
viewing evidence, and it's absolutely
Yeah.
undoctored form. You can't start
Yeah.
doing that. But people
Yeah.
were listening to him because he claimed to be the court reporter, and he was giving dangerous advice out then to would-be writers who were sort of listening
Yeah.
to that. And that's the
Yeah.
danger sometimes of some of these naysayers, isn't it?
That's very true. Sort of moving back to your Martin Draker series.
Yeah.
Um, let's tell me about the kind of the inception of the character and the first book. What was the moment you thought, okay, this is the character? Did the character come first? Did the story come first? How did that work for you?
Well, you've picked a good question there, I think, because I'm probably he was subliminally, if not consciously, sometimes influenced by my experiences. It must be. You can't separate the two.
Correct.
Although vast majority of my novels are pure fiction, and I will
Mm,
sprinkle in bits of realism, hopefully to sort of make the narrative jump out a little bit. And I've got
mm,
examples of that if you want it. But with Inside Threat, that's the first time I've
mm,
ever based a novel quite substantially on a real event.
mm,
And that was the drive for that, and that was a situation. It's a job I dealt with where, believe it or not, there was a serving police officer in real life. In the book, I've made him a police civilian employee, but he was a
mm,
serving police officer who was importing heroin from India on a regular basis.
mm,
And we went to the bosses with the information and the intelligence, and they didn't want to believe it. They sort of were gobsmacked. You know, this can't be happening. This can't be true.
mm.
And while they were umming and ahhing about what they should do,
Yeah.
it turns out the Indians were monitoring the exporters of the heroin from their end,
Ah.
and they had a telephone number for the UK buyer, and they sent it to us to do a subscriber check. And of course, it was owned by this serving police officer, so it sort of proved the intelligence. So I thought,
Wow.
well, that'd make a good story, wouldn't it? So I sort of
Yeah.
took that realism, and of course, I run with it and extrapolated
Yes.
from and gone off in right angles and tangents and upside down and all over the place, as one does with creative license. So that's what started the Deus Draco series off, and the two that follow well, they're totally made up, but that's how it began.
Wow, I love that. So when you're creating character, how do you go about creating the character of Martin? Like, what was your starting point?
I always, sometimes I get asked quite often, by ex-colleagues, oh yeah, that's so and so, it's me, isn't it? Or it's such a body and it's such a body, and I never do that because for a number of reasons. One, of course, if you do base a character considerably on a real person, then you could be liable.
Of
If you have to make
course.
that character do something a bit naughty for this to
Yeah.
serve the plot, and they
Yep.
see and recognise themselves and they're not happy, then of course you could be in hot water. So I
Yep.
always avoid that like the plague. But what I do, I'll take make a composite of personality traits and put them together. So it might be
Mm,
5% of somebody I've met, or 10% of somebody else, and
mm.
15% of somebody else, and I sort of throw them together and I play around with it. And it
Yeah.
develops during the course of writing the first draft, doesn't it? You might start
Yep.
off with the character a little bit two dimensional, but it pads out as you go along. You can always go back then and put some of that padding in earlier on, can't you?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Have you ever do you ever kind of get to a point where there's maybe a character trait that you've gone with for a while in your early draft that then you decide you completely cut out, or you introduce a new trait that then requires you to change a lot of what you've written so far? Do you ever have that kind of
yes,
difficulty?
yeah, yeah. I'm not precious with my words. You can't be, can you? You have to be quite prepared. And
Yeah.
often it's good going through a copy edit situation. They'll say, well, they don't think this works.
Yeah.
You'll change it, then you're going to go back. It's like pulling a piece of string out of a jumper, then, isn't it? You've got to go back and make sure all the damage isn't done elsewhere and make the changes that fit in with that new sort of tweak, shall we say. So, yeah, I do that as and when necessary. And sometimes you don't see that, do you, until you finish that first draft and you've put it down to cool down a little bit. And then you go, your first read through after that, and you go, oh, that doesn't fit. Oh, that's jarring with me. I don't like the way such a character is doing such a thing. That needs to be changed. And hopefully
Yeah.
you improve it, don't you, by doing that?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Kind of going back to something you mentioned earlier was that you included a lot of your personal your personal experience. You know what this world is like. It was interesting to me because there is at the moment, at the time of recording, there is a video going around on Twitter of a comic book shop owner who is having a go at the comic book industry because he's angry that the stories aren't good anymore like they used to be back in the day, and because all the writers are putting too much of themselves into their stories, and it's a little baffling to me because there's a whole kind of discourse about self insertion in various forms of media, whether that's in film or in comic books. Less so, lesser discourse that in literature like books. But I'm curious, like what is your thought on the idea of you know putting yourself or your experiences into your work, is that part of what makes you know your voice, your story, like what is your opinion on that?
I think it helps organically with me, if I'm being honest.
Mm,
I'm more of a pantser than a plotter. I'll have a very sort of very thin skeletal synopsis,
yeah,
um, and I'll probably properly plot 5,000 words,
yeah,
and then I'll go with that, uh, and then I'll stop and I'll plot the next 5,000. So I do meander quite a bit as I'm putting flesh on that skeleton. Um, I think as I'm doing it, when I'm in that, it's like in that first draft writing, it takes over
mm,
everything, doesn't it? It's just so, and I love that period of that total absorption as
mm,
you're writing, and when you're in that sort of depth of sort of thinking, I think that's when all the memories trigger and come back, and things occur to you, mid sentence, and you'd never thought about for donkey's years. You thought, oh, I've got to get that in, I've got to get that in.
yeah,
So it's quite
yeah.
organic. It's a hard one for me to sort of give you a definitive answer on how I go about that. It just sort of happens,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So again, as you know, being a former copper, um, when you are reading books or watching crime shows or whatnot, um, do you often find yourself getting kind of either frustrated or kind of scoff at where plausibility kind of goes out the window, or is there a sense of like, well, it's just a TV show, I don't really care. Like, how does that work for you?
I think with police procedural, I'm not a pedant at all,
Mm,
and I don't think anybody should be. But it's got to be believable. It's got to
mm,
be authentic.
yeah,
I think those are two of the main rules for me. And I think you can have some creative license, around that. Otherwise, you're writing in a straitjacket.
yeah,
And I've given advice to lots of people over the years about certain sort of procedural questions. And I,
mm,
and I always say, don't, if it doesn't fit with your character or your plot, don't overstress it. It's fiction after all, make up the
yeah,
answer, make up the get out of jail card if you need to be, so long as it's plausible.
right,
But
yeah,
there are certain things that do bug me, and one is
yeah,
lazy writing.
sure,
And it happens more on TV drama, I think, than in the written word. Although I'm sure it appears probably equally in both.
yeah,
But you might get a crime scene, for example, and the SEO, the DI, whoever turns up at the crime scene, he turns around to give his instruction. He'll say some
mm.
comment like, "Get me scenes of crime and the works." That
And
drives
it
me.
works.
What the hell does that mean?
Yes,
So for me, that is lazy writing. That it
yeah,
should be a little bit more informative than that. But above everything else, the overarching thing which sends me completely nuclear
mm,
is when you cause harm, and that's done for salacious purposes. And
mm,
a great example for me of that is it's often on TV,
mm,
often with the soap operas, and it'll be a courtroom scene, and you might have a witness being harangued by barristers in the witness box, or God forbid, even worse, a victim of the crime, giving their primary evidence and being
mm,
called all over the place. And I think that is just so disingenuous, but it's dangerous as well. It's
mm.
done for quick, salacious sort of results on the plot. But think
Yeah.
of the consequences. You might be putting off real victims of crime from coming forward because they will believe. That's what happens to
Right.
them
Yeah.
when they come into the criminal justice system. They will believe, especially when it's visual. I think it's even more impactful. They
Yeah.
will believe. That's what happens if they're going to come to the police and make a complaint about, especially if it's anything to do with sexual offences, even more so. And
Yeah.
that happens a lot, does that? I think it's really, really, really poor stuff when that happens. So that sends me
Yeah.
over the edge a little bit.
Yeah. I don't
Apart from
blame
that,
you.
I'm quite calm.
Yeah. What would you say is maybe one of the best kind of crime fiction shows out there? What's one that you love?
Wow, good question. That. Trying to think of the last one I really, really enjoyed. It wasn't fiction actually, but I quite enjoyed the Long Shadow. which was
Mm.
a documentary, really, wasn't it? A fictionalized documentary on the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. I thought that was excellent.
Yeah.
The way they
Yeah.
went about it from the victim perceptions
Yeah.
and really showed
Yeah.
up the cops to be the fools that they were, and they clearly
Right.
were back in
Yeah.
that day. And the
Yeah.
mistakes were made. I was very honest, that I thought.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's a good one. What about what's your take on shows like Luther? Like I was a big fan of Luther for the first like 3 or 4 seasons, and then I think they paused and they did a Netflix movie, and the Netflix movie was terrible. But what's your thoughts on shows like that? Because that's quite exaggerated. The show Luther, but I with Idris Elba. But I'm like, how does a show like that work for you?
I think if it's so obviously exaggerated
Yeah.
for dramatic effects,
Yeah.
then I've not got a great problem with it because it's
Yeah.
clearly not true and
Right.
has no sort of reflection of truth in it, has it?
Yeah.
And it's just purely there for entertainment purposes, and I think that's okay
Cool.
because
Yeah.
you'd have to be a fool to think that's the way things really go.
That's true. What do you think is the trick to then writing authentic police procedurals?
Less is more.
Mm,
When you do need procedure, it's be accurate, but and don't be straitjacket. Allow yourself some creative license. But it's more about the story and the characters in the story than the
mm,
procedure.
yeah.
Don't get too bogged down with procedure.
Yeah.
I get to name the author of the book, but I was reading one recently and I had to stop because there was so much procedure in it. It just
Mm,
became heavy. It was walking like you're walking through a field of mud.
yeah.
And it's almost as if the author wanted to get all this information across to the reader, and it ends
Yeah.
up becoming a bit of a manual.
Yeah.
And you don't need it. You just don't need it.
Yeah.
You only need it, I think, if it's important to the story and it moves the story along.
Yes.
Then yeah,
Yeah.
but sometimes little snippets work much better, and you can
Yeah.
have several of those throughout, can't you?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's
I,
how I
I
tend to
I
write.
agree with you on that. I agree with that entirely. So let's go back and talk a little bit about your history working with within the police. So was that something you always wanted to do? How did you find yourself, you know, applying and going that route?
Well, I sort of left school at 15 without much in the way of qualifications back in that day. I
Mm.
got some sense, but I didn't have any of that. I was too busy messing about, really. Um, and so my first job was in a chicken factory, and I got sacked
Right. Yeah.
from there. Yeah, it didn't last long. About 6 weeks, they sacked me from there. So I thought I'd diversify. So I went to a pie factory.
Right.
So yeah, so I got sacked from there as well. So I got right rollicking off my old man. I thought, well, I better try and do something semi-sensible.
Right.
So I'll have a go at the place, see how that goes.
Yeah.
Nearly got sacked from there a couple of times in the early days when I was doing the training. But anyway, I managed to survive that and calm down and fast forward 31 years, and I was still there.
Nice, nice. So it was just you just kind of landed there by sort of jumping from there. That didn't work, and then that one just stuck.
Had I not been sacked from the chicken factory, I could have still been there.
Fair enough. So I have some questions from some individuals that wanted to kind of get inside the mind of someone who's worked in the police and
Sure.
who also write crime fiction and things like that. So one question was, is there anyone that you've come across that you've in your investigations that there was someone you wanted to catch for a particular thing, but for one reason or another couldn't? And if so, are you allowed to talk about that?
There's many occasions when that happens,
Mm,
and as bitterly disappointing as that is,
mm,
um, you've got to move on.
yeah,
You've got to move because there's other investigations that need your attention,
yeah,
and with victims attached to them.
yeah,
And sometimes you got to go where the leads are.
yeah,
Um, that doesn't mean you can't go back and have a fresh pair of eyes on something,
mm,
but sometimes it's just you've gone down a dead end street and there's no way out of it.
yeah,
Um, and it's hard. It's hard, and you get used to it. And
Mm.
the more you do, the more you get used to it. But you don't never get completely used to it. But
Yeah.
you've got to prioritise, and if you've got a live line of inquiry with another investigation, because you never have one at a time, you only have several on the go at once at any
Yeah.
one time, and you get a bit of a breakthrough on one of them, and then you've got to run with that. It's your duty to do that for that person who's the victim of that particular crime. But yeah, you don't forget the ones the ones that get away, and
Yeah.
and it's worse when you know who's done it as well.
Yeah.
That's even
Yeah.
worse, and you can't get the
Yeah.
evidence together that's sufficient
Yeah.
to put them on trial, and you know they've
Yeah.
done it, and they know that they've done it,
Yeah.
and that one's particularly difficult.
Yeah. How often do you think would you say that happens or happened in for with you at least or yeah.
Oh, it's regular,
Yeah.
and sometimes you've got enough to get them arrested, and you
Mm.
interview them, and you go to the CPS with the evidence. You think you've got enough to put them on
Yeah.
trial, and the CPS might disagree with you,
Yeah.
and they walk free, and that's really sort of difficult.
Yeah. So maybe because just for people who are listening who might not understand like that whole process, like so maybe and also people might want to kind of get a more authentic idea of that. So how does that situation work? Like what could it be that what amount of evidence would say that you would have that you put forward, and on what basis would that be rejected and then allow that person to go free?
Okay. Well, to start the game off, you've got to have
Mm.
reasonable suspicion
Yeah.
to arrest somebody. That's not a suspicion. That's a suspicion based on facts, not just
Yeah.
mere suspicion
Yeah.
or intelligence. It's got to be. You've got to have some hard facts that justify
Yeah.
that arrest. That's just a starting point.
Mm.
And then when that person's in custody, you'll be doing things like interviewing witnesses. You might be searching the house if it involves, acquisitive crime. These
Yeah.
sort of things. Interviews.
Mm.
Where you try and catch people out. Sometimes they're coming out with, a false alibi or whatever, and all
Mm.
that process goes through. And eventually
Yeah.
you get to a situation where you've got to either charge somebody or let them go.
Yeah.
Now, if the custody sergeant agrees you've got enough to charge them, then you charge them.
Yeah.
But before that happens, it goes to the CPS.
Which
Now,
is what is the CPS? So for those who don't know.
that's the Crown Prosecution Service.
Yeah.
And they have absolute autonomy on rights to charge or not.
Mm.
Now, there's a lot of debate about how far the line should go, because initially what it used to be, the CPS would authorise charge if they felt there was a prima facie case. And what I mean by that is sufficient evidence to put before a court for a court to consider.
Yeah.
They then changed the rules a little bit disingenuously, I think, to get their conviction rate up. They changed the rules and said they would only authorise charge when they believed there was more than a 50% chance of getting a conviction. Now that's a higher bar than just having prima facie evidence.
Mm.
And a lot of detectives think, well, that's just them playing judge and jury. It's for the judge and jury to decide whether somebody is guilty of a crime, as long as you have a prima facie case. But that's the situation we're in, and that's the situation as it exists today. So they will not authorise charge unless they believe there's a more than 50% chance of getting a conviction, which is a very subjective test for an individual lawyer to have to make.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Another question that I have is regarding the deployment of undercover operatives.
Yeah.
The idea that the question is they think that this needs to be done by a superintendent, but when and how is this decision made to deploy, and in what type of cases is it done?
Right. Okay. It's a great tool, but it has to be justified. It has to be proportionate to the investigation. There has to be a likely outcome that it'll provide what you're after. And you've also got a lot of other issues to consider as well. To authorise one, and it's above superintendent. I think it's assistant chief constable who authorises undercover officers, so it's quite high up. It has to be justified and proportionate. That's the main thing. And they also look at the intrusion into innocent people's lives as well. because
Mm.
what you're doing is sending somebody into a situation to create a false friendship, for want of a
Yeah.
better expression,
Yeah.
um, with somebody, with somebody you believe to be an active criminal.
Mm.
You're intruding on their personal life to
Mm-hmm.
gain information, which is a huge, huge intrusion in any democracy. So that
Yeah.
has to be justified. But also, they have to consider the potential fallout, people around that person. So there's a lot of consideration goes into an authority. There has to be a risk assessment done of these issues, and there has to be a risk reduction plan of any issues that stand out. So there's an awful lot goes into it. You don't just say, who can be undercover today? You can. Off you go and get on with it. There's an
Yeah.
awful lot goes into it that people don't always realise. I mean, they don't always get it right, the cops, and when they
Right. Yeah.
don't, they get a kick in, and rightly so,
Yeah.
because it is a very specialised tool,
Yeah.
and if you abuse it, then Parliament might take it away, and
Yeah.
that'd be a crying shame.
Yeah.
And I have to say also, the people who do that job, they're very
Mm.
specially trained to a higher level. They get
Yeah.
paid no more than anybody else, and
Yeah.
often put their own lives at stake. Quite often, literally. So it's an interesting area because it's a grey area.
Yeah.
So there's no hard and fast rules about how a deployment should go. You might put somebody in. I've run many
Mm.
undercover operations. I've done undercover work many years ago.
Yeah.
Um, and each day you've got to look at what's happening, what you're getting back, what are the risks
Yeah.
involved, what are the outcomes, what are the potential outcomes. It's not a panacea. It might not work for everything. You might have to pull somebody out with an exit strategy and don't put them
Yeah.
back in.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a fascinating grey area where every day you're coming up with a cunning plan, to quote Baldrick, to try and get
Yeah.
around whatever the issue might be.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of like the individual who has to do that kind of job, I'm just curious as to how that how do you I guess how do you go about getting trained for that kind of position, and what kind of natural skills are involved in that?
The people who are picked, and it's all voluntary as well, so you can't ever order anybody to be an undercover officer. It's all voluntary. They
Right.
go on
Yeah.
a very, very strict training course, and the
Mm.
attrition rate is quite high on that. And a
Mm.
lot of it's about this, the psychology of the individual as well,
Mm.
um, and their ability to withstand pressure, not show a reaction.
Right.
You can hit them with a dynamic situation, and they'll be calm about it, and they'll deal with it. They could be like the
Mm.
proverbial duck, calm on the surface with the legs going mental under the water. That's fine.
Right.
But it's an ability to be able to do that. It's all about communication skills as well. That's the
Yeah.
massive point of that. Picking the level of the to communicate with somebody. You could be an undercover officer into an art theft. You could be dealing
Yeah.
with somebody very, very educated, very academically minded, and you need to be able to communicate on that level with them.
Mm.
Likewise, you could be dealing with some street punk who goes around robbing old ladies,
Right.
and you need to be able to communicate on his level without appearing
Yeah.
patronising either. So it's
Yeah.
all about communication skills and pitching your communication skills at the right level. It's quite a
Yeah.
fascinating area actually.
Yeah. 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 It's a fun sort of, not fun, but it's a it gives that impression of a very chameleon like quality that
Very
that
much
someone
so. That's
needs.
a great phrase to use. Very much so.
Yeah.
Fit in with
Yeah.
your environment, and
Yeah.
absolute chameleon. Yeah,
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
fun for a crime fiction writer though. You've got such scope there to play with.
You do. There's so much. There's so much you could do. That just the stuff you were mentioning now is like an art theft. You got to go into that situation. You got to dock in that level. That in and of itself, you could run away with a fun story like that.
Of course you could. Yeah.
Um, which I think is why, like for me, like I always gravitate more towards private eye fiction in
Hmm.
general. Like I love my Raymond Chandlers and
Yes.
Dishelle Hammett's and stuff like that. Sarah Pretsky, Robert B. Parker. Um, and I think one of the qualities I like about it is there is that dynamic of the chameleon like aspect to their particular kinds of work, trying to weasel their way into places and needing to kind of jump between. Um, that sometimes the police procedural, though fun, you can't always get away with that as such, depending because of your the role. If you're a, it feels like to me there's less, maybe less opportunity for chameleon like stuff unless that protagonist is within that, within that role, I guess, moving in. But maybe I could be wrong about that.
Well, the beauty
Yes,
of the private eye trial, of course, is that you've got no rules.
exactly.
You're not constrained by authorities and risk assessments and all the rest of it. You can just go there, and you've got sort of
Exactly.
a broad sort of canvas there to play with, and that's where a lot of the
Yep.
really great PI characters came from, didn't they?
Yeah.
Off the
Yeah.
wall, gritty sort of individuals who do, were all over the
Yeah.
place, and they were very entertaining to read about them, isn't it?
Exactly. I love it. Another question I have is, you need a home office warrant for a phone tap, but only a superintendent can sign off on a probe. So basically, which to my friend's mind seems far more intrusive. And so his question is why? Is there a is there a throwback to the past, or is there a reason for this?
Okay, I've dealt with both several
Mm,
times. The Home Office warrant for interception of a telephone is probably the greatest intrusion, or considered
mm,
the greatest intrusion into somebody's private life.
yeah.
And because of that, the process and the authority level is extremely high. Only the Home Secretary himself can sign that warrant. You
Ah,
can't get anybody else to do it. He has to
mm,
do it wherever he is in the world. He has to sign that warrant. And
yeah.
every 2 weeks, it's reviewed to make sure it's getting what it's supposed to get.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the authority is pulled. As simple as that.
Yeah.
Um, the process of getting a warrant of interception, and they are rare. Let me just say this: we don't live in a police state,
Yeah.
thank God. They're
Yes.
very rare. It has to be
Yeah.
serious crime.
Yeah.
Um, unless it's a threat to life, which is a different set of rules altogether. That's something that happens quite quickly. But the normal procedure can take about 3 months,
Wow.
and that application will have to show the criminal use of the telephone. It'll have to show the criminal use of the criminal. It'll have to show the people they're connecting with that are also criminals, the network, the
Yeah.
lieutenants underneath the sort of head criminal, if you will, and all that has to be evidenced. And then sort of prove that the interception will give you what you expect.
Mm,
And as I say, it's every 2 weeks. I mean, I had a situation once where we did all this. It was an armed robber,
mm,
and we knew he was planning some more armed robberies. And we
mm.
got everything done. We got the interception in place, and then so and so went on holiday for 2 weeks. We didn't know about this, obviously. So for 2 weeks, there was nothing coming off the interception that was criminal,
Wow.
and the authority was pulled. We had to start from scratch.
Oh,
It
jeez.
was as frustrating as that was, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
I'd probably rather have it that way
Yeah.
than the sort of police states of South America.
Right.
But and we had to stop. I mean, you got fast track, thankfully. You didn't have to wait another 3 months, but
Yeah.
it was stopped because nothing came off it. The deception wasn't delivering.
Wow.
And the other thing about telephone deception in this country
Mm.
is that it can never be used in a court of law. And
Oh,
not
yes. Yeah.
only can it not be used in a court of law, the existence of the assistance from it cannot be made public. And in fact, it's against the law to ever do
Mm.
that.
Ah.
Whereas a probe, a bug in
Mm.
somebody's house, which again, that's an assistant chief constable, it's not a superintendent. It's way above that. It's
Mm.
ACC level.
Yeah.
And again, you go through the same sort of questions and answers you do for an undercover officer. It's a similar sort of level of authority,
Mm.
but that can be used in a court of law. So
Mm.
that is the huge difference.
So why can one and why not the other?
It's just the way it's always been.
Right.
Um,
I love that.
yeah, it's just the way it's always been. I think telephone deception probably came first.
Mm.
That was considered so intrusive that it was
Yeah.
dealt the way it's dealt with, and
Mm.
and I think the existence of pro or the use of pros probably came after that.
Yeah.
Um, and it was all initially it's all based on Home Office guidance before they sort of enacted on it. It was never lawful or never unlawful. It was all done
Right.
by sort of Home Office guidance, and then they brought out legislation to actually cover it. So that
Right.
sort of came afterwards, and I think that's why it's allowed in evidence. I mean,
Yeah.
most countries around Europe, the telephone interception is used in evidence,
Yeah.
but we're one of the few exceptions to that.
Yeah. That's
I mean,
fascinating.
yeah.
That's fascinating. Well, we'll wrap up here in a second, but this has been a lot of fun. But I'm curious. So
I hope so.
your Martin Draker series has just been re-released. In October. Through Sharp. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Sharp watch, yeah.
Yes. What's next? What's coming next?
I've got a standalone with the publisher at the moment that hopefully is going to get greenlit.
Nice.
And I'm fairly confident that will happen. And I'm also working on some new ideas for a new series,
Nice.
which is what they want me to do. So I'm looking at that.
Nice.
And there may well be some more Martin Draker in the future. So yeah, lots going on really.
Fantastic. Do you want to give us a hint about what the standalone might be?
I can't tell you too much, but it's unusual. I'll give you a sound bite. I've put together two very unlikely bedfellows. I've put together a retired chief constable and a retired DI who so far apart, normally they would never come together, but they have to come together for reasons that I can't tell you just yet.
Right.
So I've not seen anywhere in modern crime fiction where you have such disparity of sort of main protagonists from different levels. So that was quite interesting playing around with that.
Nice.
Trying to be a chief
like
constable one day and then a grumpy old DI the next, and then put them together.
I like it. It's the ultimate odd couple. I like
it is an odd couple. It's a great phrase, and that's called the Cabal. That, by the way, that's
nice.
I'm fairly confident that's going to get greenlit. Waiting for a contract this week actually on that, so hopefully that'll be coming out soon.
Great. No, that's cool. I look forward to that. And if you want to plug yourself, plug your work, where can people find you on social media? All that kind of stuff.
Well, you can find me. You just put my name into Amazon or even just Google. If my Amazon author page is there with all my books. But if you go to my website, it's got all my social media links from there, from which people can either sign up for my newsletter if they wish, be the first in any giveaways and any information. But also my social media links are on my website. Please do follow me and let's interact. My website is www.rogerapriceauthor.co.uk. Don't forget the A in the middle, Roger A. Price, author.co.uk, and let's chat.
Fantastic. Yeah, and anyone listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, there will be links in the description of this podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, there will also be links in the description of this video. So there'll be links for all of to get right to Roger's books and go buy away and make him a best-selling author to rival Ian Rankin.
That would be nice.
Wouldn't it just? But yeah, so this was a lot of fun, Roger. I'm glad you could make the time to come on and talk about your publishing journey, a bit about your history with the police, and answer some questions about policing, which I always find quite fascinating, and love hearing about the real stuff, and also how you make the real stuff sound good in fiction without being, as you were talking about that one book, kind of overdoing it and sounding more like a handbook. So yeah, this was a lot of fun, and hopefully we'll bring you back in the near future.
That'll be great. I've enjoyed it. Thanks so much for the invite, and I really enjoyed it, and I would come back anytime. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Everyone, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you.
The Secret Circle.